Hello?
Hey, Rich, it's Larson. You got a minute?
Sure, Larson, what's up?
Hello and welcome to the Got a Minute podcast. It's Larson Hicks, and I'm missing my co-host, Pastor Rich Lusk. It is not his fault. It's 100% my fault. We were supposed to do this at a different time, but I'm traveling in a different time zone, and I totally got my time zones mixed up. So we're sad not to have Rich joining us today. So I've committed to doing my very best Rich Lusk impersonation. But we'll see how that goes. So I'm really excited, though. We've been looking forward to this podcast with Jordan Bush. Jordan is with the TGFB, Thank God for Bitcoin group, and they are putting on a conference soon. They've been putting on conferences. Is this the first, or you guys have put on multiple of these, right?
No, this is our third annual.
Okay. Yeah. So I knew about it because I think you guys had Sierra Wiley. Did you guys have? Did Michael
came and spoke last
speak
year?
On any of these? Yeah.
So okay. No, yeah. See, Michael was there last year, but only Chris spoke last year. So yeah, Chris Wiley spoke last year.
Okay. Well, there's our touch point. That's where the overlap is, and Jordan's out at a church that's similar to our church, part of the same denomination in Pensacola. So we've got a lot in common. Tell me your story, man. Before we jump into Bitcoin, such an interesting topic. It's something I've thought about a lot. I'm very interested in learning more about. We have people in our church who are fanatical about Bitcoin. You know, it kind of spans the scale, especially when it's doing well, right? Those folks are especially fanatical.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of hype, but then there's also there's a lot of concern as well. You know, so. I think it'd be really fun to just kind of hear your big picture or thoughts about it. And I've got some comments and questions that Rich shared with me. So so we'll try to do our best to dive into some of those as well. But yeah, welcome to the show, Jordan. Thanks for coming on, man. And give us the kind of 30,000 foot overview. What's your story?
Yeah. So again, first of all, thank you for having me. Again, grateful to you guys, and again, I've had seen some friends who are really liked your podcast, and so I'm looking forward to investigating some more episodes in the future. I also found out that you guys are part of helping produce another one of my favorite podcasts, the Theology Podcast. So
yes,
shout to the podcast guys.
Love those guys.
For them. In terms of my story, again, this is. Hopefully this is a helpful thing. If you're coming into this, if you've even stopped to listen to this and you're thinking like, why on earth should I care about Bitcoin? Bitcoin is just that thing that guy from high school who hasn't talked to me in 20 years reaches out to me and is trying to get me to do it. I totally understand that's the that's the paradigm, and the temptation is going to be just to ignore it or just think it's stupid or whatever.
Right.
And so hopefully my story will accomplish for you at least a little bit of what it kind of happened for me. So my wife and I got married knowing that we wanted to be missionaries. We were initially anticipating moving to a jungle tribe to take the gospel to people who'd never heard it before.
Wow.
And so in God's providence, we got married. We'd been married for about a year and we got pregnant. And so, my wife is a few months pregnant. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, what does this look like? Do we still go to the jungle tribe with like a newborn? And so in God's providence, he brought along some friends of ours who were going to be going to plant a church in Montevideo, Uruguay, in South America. So right between Brazil and Argentina. And so long story short, we ended up deciding to join their team. And we went to Uruguay. Both my wife and I were philosophy majors. So we were anticipating, planting a church among very secular people. Uruguay has about over 40% of the population that claims to either be atheist or agnostic. And so we went anticipating, ministering to very secular people. We got there, and within a few months, the church was I guess the church had been planning a few months before we got there. We went with like a team of people. And so as we got there and started ministering, we quickly found that more than half of our church members were Venezuelan immigrants. So not what we were expecting. And so again, me, the curious, former philosophy major was like, well, what are all these Venezuelans doing here? There were 60,000 Venezuelans who over the course of a couple of years poured into Uruguay. And so again, long story short, ended up finding out that they were there because the government had hyperinflated their currency.
Right.
They had, basically this is how it works with democracies is, you have an election every 4-6 years or whatever. And so one of the key tactics that both sides of the incumbent and the newcomer that they have to try to convince people to vote for them is telling them that they're going to give them free stuff. And so the question is, where does that free stuff come from? And frequently, and this is what I realized is, frequently today that it gets, paid for by debt or just printing money out of thin air. And so we were seeing just the late stage of this process of creating new money to and giving it out to people, whether directly or in the form of entitlements, other programs. And so what we found is that we had people in our church who were former, who were economists, who were doctors, who were people who were making literally $100,000 a year, denominated in dollar terms, who 2 or 3 years later couldn't pay the rent. And so I'm sitting here and I'm like, okay, this is crazy. We had fathers moving to Uruguay, leaving their wives and kids, which resulted in infidelity, which resulted in divorce, kids growing up without their parents. So as I'm sitting there seeing this, I'm like, man, this is awful. What do you really do about this beyond what we were, just the very immediate needs that we were helping to serve? So we were doing counseling with people, we're, buying food for, basic foodstuffs for people. And so over the course of 4 years, as we were doing that, again, I had these like lingering questions in my head of like, I don't know what you do about this. And, this is really hard. And then after 4 years in 2019, I basically got into Bitcoin. I was pastoring our church. I was, doing that. We're doing sermon prep. And, as missionaries, one of the things that, not very many people talk about is, as missionaries with every year that goes by, you have to go raise more and more support most of the time. And so this can either look like going back to the States to do that, or it can look like trying to do this from distance. And so as I was trying to do that and had done a little bit of that, I was also trying to wrap my head around, like our missions organization had the nonprofit equivalent of a 401k. It's called a 403b that their missionaries have to do. And so in the 4 years that we've been in Uruguay, I don't think I'd even looked at it in terms of, what to invest in. And so after 4 years, I just started thinking, man, I really ought to do something with this, but I'm not an investor. I don't know much about investing. The only thing that I knew was you should buy low and sell high. And so I was like, okay, well, that's intuitive. That makes sense. And so I started to take a look at, all the different options and try to listen to some investing stuff to get my head around it. And the thing that I quickly found was that everything, all from stocks to real estate to all these things, everything is at all-time highs ever in the history of the United States. And so I thought to myself, well, if you're supposed to buy low and sell high, what do you buy when everything is at all-time highs? Right. And so that was also in the back of my mind, and I just didn't know what to do. So again, ended up starting to look into Bitcoin. Initially, it was the money, the price of it denominated in dollars was flying up and down rapidly, and I just thought, like, what is this thing? I don't understand it at all. And so I just went down the rabbit hole of trying to understand, where it came from, why it had been created. And the thing that just stopped me in my tracks was to realize that it was created in 2008 in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And it was created to be a money that a government couldn't hyperinflate or government couldn't, create out of thin air. Obviously, we all know the housing crisis, all these things, and the government just basically bailed them out, bailed out all these degenerate bankers. And then, they did pay it back, all this kind of stuff. But they just did that out of thin air. None of them went to jail. Plenty of normal people lost their houses, disproportionately affected your normal people. And they get off scot-free. So Bitcoin was created to be a money that you can't do that with. And so I just thought, man, this is crazy. The parallel between, or just the relationship between all these people in our church are here because of this issue. Bitcoin is created to deal with that issue. Man, that's really interesting. And so the other crazy part of this was, again, as I was pastoring this church, we ended up merging the church with another small church plant, actually church plant sent by Alistair Begg's church.
Oh, wow.
So very, very grateful for those guys. They're doing really good work. And so we ended up merging our churches together the week before COVID, crazily enough. And so, and I guess we started in April 2020, I ended up in a Zoom call doing a book club with a number of other Christians who were into Bitcoin. I just had found somebody on Twitter. They invited me to do this thing. And I was like, okay, sure. One day a week for like an hour, we were doing this book club. I was like, hey, that sounds fun to do during COVID. So we started reading 2 books. The first book was a book called The Ethics of Money Production by an Austrian economist named Jörg Guido Hulsmann. He's a German guy he's a fellow of the Mises Institute, and he teaches at a university in France. And so we read this book by him where he basically built on the work of a 15th century Catholic bishop named Nicholas Oresme, and just basically tried to unpack the issue of the fact that money creation has ethical considerations involved. Christians, throughout many years have done a great job to elaborate on the fact that, the things that we do with our money have moral import. They obviously, there's some moral implications of what we do with our money. But what Hulsmann and Oresme were trying to demonstrate is that money creation itself has moral implications, where it comes from, how you do or don't create it. And so I read this book. We all read this book together, and it just blew my mind. It just floored me. Again, Oresme grounded this objection in one of the 10 commandments: "Thou shalt not steal." He was calling out the prince of whatever nation he was in. The prince was adding baser metals into the money supply, into the supply of coins, so that he could create more coins than he could have if he had just used 99% gold or silver or whatever it was. So it was a way for the government to increase its purchasing power. And he said, this is illegitimate. You're doing this in secret. You're changing the ratio of the pure metal with the baser metals, and this is wrong. And so again, anybody who can ground seemingly unspiritual, happenings in the reality of that, everything we do, everything we do, whether we eat or drink, we should do for the glory of God. And that if not done for that reason, it can be sinful. I just really appreciate it. So we read the book, finished that one, and then we started reading another book by an author that I'm sure you'll be more familiar with, and that's Gary North. We read a book called Honest Money, which is a much more popular level book than Hulsmann's treatment. So we ended up reading, which this was hilarious because the rest of of the people who were doing this book club with, the farthest thing you could possibly imagine from Theonomist. I could tell you a story, just the farthest thing from a Theonomist. And they were all reading this book and all really appreciating the arguments that he's making. And so we took a month to finish that one. We ended up finishing the book clubs over a course of 2 months or something. And then, we just said, hey, that was great. Goodbye. It was great to meet you guys. And so 2 weeks go by. I thought, well, that was the weirdest thing that I've ever done in my life. And then 2 weeks later, one of the other guys who took part in the book club reached out to me and said, hey man, Jordan, we really appreciated your contributions to the book club. I was the only person at that point in vocational ministry. And so I did, bring a different both perspective and again, biblical background in terms of theologically, I was the most in tune theological person, at least at that point. Yeah. And so he reached out and said, hey, we're going to write our own book that basically summarizes what Hulsmann and North talk about, but rather than their conclusion and their payoff, which in both cases is, basically we should go back to the gold standard. Gold is going back to the gold standard is the way to basically, bring us back under the alignment of a scarce money. We think this is a good thing to do. Rather than doing that, we're going to write our own book, but the payoff is going to be, we think we should go towards Bitcoin rather than going back. As crazy as this sounds, we think that going forward and moving to a Bitcoin standard actually accomplishes a lot of the things that they're talking about, but it actually has teeth in that it overcomes some of the limitations and weaknesses of gold that allowed gold to reach the state that it is right now, which is for most people irrelevant. And so he presented this. I said, man, I don't know. I'm pastoring this church. I don't know if I have time to do that. And so long story short, he said, well, there's going to be 8 of us who are working on this together. We're going to, basically do a couple sprints where on a Saturday, we'll take 4 hours. And then beyond that, we're just going to do 1 hour a week like you did with the book club. So I ended up saying, okay, ended up agreeing to do it. And over the course of the next 6 months, we ended up writing this book. The book ended up being called Thank God for Bitcoin. And so we ended up in God's providence. The book was released the same week as a book by the Pope. And I tell everyone we got to experience every Protestant's dream, which was, the book came out the same week as the book by the Pope, and we were outselling the Pope within the first couple of weeks. So we said, take that, Bishop of Rome. How do you like that? And
awesome.
yeah, and so again, over the course of 6 months, we ended up selling a bunch of copies. It ended up coinciding with Bitcoin's price going crazy over over 2021, and so it just ended up selling way more copies and being way more, people appreciate it way more than we ever imagined than anybody would. So then again, coming to the end here, basically we ended up coming back from Uruguay in the end of 2021. And so throughout this time, again, throughout the years that we've been there pastoring, there's other reasons, but one of the things is I'd been sitting there thinking about the issue of baptism. And so I'd read and listened to a bunch of stuff from Doug Wilson, read and listened to a bunch of stuff from Peter Lightheart, James B. Jordan, Alistair Roberts, and maybe even a little bit by Rich Lusk. And by the time we were coming up on the end of our time, I was just thinking to myself, man, I think the Paedo Baptists are right.
Yeah.
And then I also thought, but I really am pretty sure all of our Reformed Baptists or all of our Baptist supporters and supporting churches are probably going to be less than thrilled than we are with this development. And so I just kind of came back, my family, we came back, and we're just trying to figure out what the next steps look like. And so came back, and long story short, I ended up being asked by some of the other authors of the book to put together a one-day conference for people who were interested in the subject matter, and ended up doing that. And then some of the other, again, when that was a success, some of the guys who were all either early Bitcoin adopters or independent entrepreneurs and had made successful businesses just basically said, hey man, while you try to figure out what you're going to do long term in terms of ministry, if you're willing to work full time to basically help Christians understand both money more broadly and then Bitcoin specifically, like, we're willing to fund it. And so they gave me and basically gave me a few year runway to just work on this full time. So that's what I've been doing for the last 2 years. And the Lord's been real kind and had, opened up a lot of really just timely and interesting conversations and put me in a lot of places that's been really neat. So that's awesome. The Cliff Notes version of kind of how
that's really cool.
How I got there.
Yeah, well, thanks for going through the whole story. And I think especially, the part about, being in Uruguay and the all the folks coming from Venezuela and how that really, that ties really directly into Bitcoin and currency and the impact of, monetary policy and, the real life impact on monetary policy. So I'd love to just for listeners who are not, fully, haven't geeked out yet on Bitcoin. Can you just explain what it is, explain why it's different from, say, fiat versus like a gold standard kind of money? What's the difference? How does it work?
Yeah. So the big thing is, Bitcoin's a digital currency. It's a decentralized digital currency. So rather than, with the existing financial system that we have right now, there's the Federal Reserve and there's, the Treasury, where there's central points where they create, lots of money. This is an oversimplification. There's also, a lot of our money today is created in the private sector through the issuance of new loans. So that's one common misconception. But we have basically money that's able to be created out of thin air through the issuance of new debt. That's kind of the world that we've lived in for the better half of the last 100 years. And so up to this point, for most of human history, money has been, whatever you've used this money, there's things from shells to rocks, to precious metals and, other things. But whatever they've been, one of the core tenets of money has been that it's been scarce. This is a desirable thing. So now why does that matter? Again, our time is scarce. Our resources are scarce. Our labor is scarce. And so, when you're trying to do an exchange, money is this thing that allows us to, exchange what we have for what we need. One of the things is you want to trade as much as you can like things for like things. And so you're trying to find some sort of equilibrium of the value of, equilibrium of value to, or a value of money to the amount of the labor that you're doing. You're trying to find some sort of equilibrium. You want to give like things for other like things. And so historically, there's been a number of characteristics of money, you could say. So one of them, again, when you're looking at a money, you want something that is like a store of value. Okay, that's historically been one thing. You want something that's a medium of exchange, and then money serves as like a unit of account. So this is pretty intuitive, right? Like if why don't we use something like sand for money? Well, because most of the time you could go out and just find sand anywhere without doing any work,
Right.
and you could exchange it for things that are more scarce that require more work, and so that won't work. So yeah, store of value is one part. Medium of exchange is more intuitive. That's probably the thing that most people think about when they think about money. It's something that's got to be able to be exchanged. And so one of the things that people look at Bitcoin as a weakness right now is the fact that many people aren't accepting it as a medium of exchange. And so they look at this and go, well, how can Bitcoin be money if nobody's even using it like that? And then store of value obviously is unit of account is kind of the last thing. But the thing that I would point out to people, and the thing that, again, the point of clarification to the people who would look at this as a weakness of Bitcoin is what you're actually seeing in those three things is that there's a time component within this. So Bitcoin as a store of value, as a medium of exchange, what determines whether or not something is a medium of exchange or a store of value? Well, people's willingness to find it valuable and then to exchange it. Right. So again, there's disagreements within economic circles of which of these, which is the cart that goes before the horse, or which of these ought to be the point of origination. And so there's some people who say, well, something's got to be a medium of exchange before it can be a store of value. To me, that just doesn't make any sense, right? Because why would I exchange something? Why would I buy something in the first place in order to exchange it if I don't already find it valuable? And so this is kind of where you're at. So with gold and silver, these things made really good money because why? They require work to produce. You can't just find them anywhere. Obviously, you can stumble across gold, but like it's far less likely. Most of the time, you have to pay people to dig it up out of the ground, refine it, do all kinds of stuff. Eventually, put a stamp on it to certify. In some cases. For a long time, you had gold that was just used by the weight. They would measure the weight of it. It didn't even have to have like a stamp of a Caesar or something like that. So again, there's lots of things in this process, but ideally you want something that's scarce, something that takes work to produce, something that can't be easily, imitated falsely. You don't want forgeries. If something's super easy to forge, you don't want that. And so again, there's a whole history for why we use the money that we use throughout history. Today, we use fiat currency. Fiat currency actually exists because of a weakness of gold. One of the weaknesses of gold, it's great in terms of being scarce, in terms of being portable. You can carry it around. You can do store value. There's lots of things in ways in which gold is valuable and just desirable. But one of the things that's difficult about it is that it's heavy. Yeah. Gold is heavy, and it tends to centralize because nobody likes walking around, with gold. Small amounts of gold get very valuable or are very valuable, and so you could easily be robbed if you were walking around, with some gold. And so basically, people were like, this isn't ideal to have this thing that I could have tons of my wealth stolen. And so one of the ways around this was the idea of having paper certificates or like gold-backed certificates. Yeah. So people are storing their gold in a bank that has guys with guns and thick walls. They're like, okay, we'll store that there. And then we'll create a scarce number of certificates that correspond with the amount of gold that you have. And then we'll spend those certificates out in the market. And then, but at any point, anybody could just go back and exchange those certificates for the gold itself, which is the check on the system. Right. And so again, this was a decent system as long as it worked. But then over time, it was so much more convenient to use the certificates than using the gold that people just started just using the certificates, just using the paper certificates all the time in normal commerce. And so then what happened at that point is you have these banks that have all of this gold that's just sitting there. In 99.9% of the time, that gold, like there's no run on the bank. There's nothing like this. People aren't coming all at once to get, withdraw their gold. So they're sitting there looking at this and they're like, okay, well, what if we were to lend out some of this gold that was there? We lend it out to people who don't have the gold, and then we charge a level of interest, so we can turn this liability, or turn this gold that's just sitting there into something that can actually generate more money, both for us and for the owners of the gold. Right. And so basically, this is kind of how things started to move towards the place where we are now. So started doing this, and so then the question is, how much percent should we be able to lend out? Well, and how much should we just keep here? And so it started at a few percent, and then it started the percentage creeps up, and then over time it gets worse and worse and worse, and now you get to the place where today we have a completely unbacked currency. It's not backed by gold or silver or anything. And even in terms of the lending requirements, as of 2020, when COVID started, government, there is a zero reserve that banks have to maintain on hand in order to, just to resume their normal, banking, business. So basically right now we have a currency that went from being 100% backed. It went from being 100% backed to not backed at all. And so again, we're still reaping the efficiency benefit, but people are starting to experience, that all isn't well, and that, this is producing, incentivizing and creating a world that's increasingly crazy. So.
Yeah, that helps. And so, Bitcoin, how is Bitcoin different from a gold-backed dollar or some other monetary tool?
Yeah. So again, why would you say it's a great question? Why would I say that gold is similar to Bitcoin or Bitcoin is similar to gold without some of the weaknesses? So Bitcoin, just like gold, requires work to produce. It requires the expenditure of actual real world resources. So in the case of gold, you have to, again, with gold, you have to pay people to dig it up out of the ground. You have to pay them to refine it. You have to give them, pay for tools for them to do that with. So there's a fixed production cost to gold. Likewise, there's a fixed production cost to Bitcoin. We can go a lot of directions with this, but the short version of this is, there's only two ways to get Bitcoin. One of them is to buy a computer, plug it in, and pay for the electricity to power the Bitcoin mining computer to try to solve these complex math problems, which is a crude way of putting it, but they have to, they're spending tremendous amount of real world energy to try to guess a number to be the one who wins what's something called the block reward. You have to expend real world resources in order to do that. Or you can buy Bitcoin using another currency, using a fiat currency or whatever it is, from somebody who's already done that process. Yeah. So there's no way to create Bitcoin for free out of thin air without there being a cost associated with it. And so again, that makes a humongous difference. And this is why. Because at the end of the day, whoever, if you're producing the money, or I guess at the end of the day, basically, the kind of money that you use is based on, or it says something about the way that you believe the world functions. Mm-hmm. Okay. There's a theologian, and he's a guy who's written a number of books. His name is James K.A. Smith. He wrote a book called You Are What You Worship. He's written a number of different books. But one of the things that he touched on that a pastor in Nebraska named Bob Thune talked about, he had a piece. And in this piece, he quoted James K. Smith, and where James K. Smith said this. He said that every pedagogy has a philosophical anthropology. Okay, and so this piece that Thune was writing was about education. And so what Thune was unpacking was that basically James K. Smith was saying that every philosophy of teaching, or your view about what you believe about teaching people or teaching children or whatever it is rooted in first rooted in an understanding of what you believe about anthropology, what you believe about what people are like. And so the thing that's been kicking around in my mind ever since I started getting into Bitcoin is just the reality that you can say the same thing about money. Every money or every currency is rooted in a philosophy of anthropology. It's rooted in an understanding of what people are, who people are, and how the world works. So here's the example of this. So with where you live, if we take something like gold, gold basically exists in a world, and basically it says in order to have gold, you have to work first, and then you get the benefit of that work second. Okay, so I have to dig it up out of the ground in order to have it. I can't have it first, and if I haven't done the work. And so now, why does this matter? Again, that just seems okay. Like I could see how that would be, important. But as I was doing sermon prep, we were in Uruguay. I was in the book of Galatians, and Galatians chapter 6. The Apostle Paul says this. He says that God is not mocked, for what a man sows, that will he also reap. And so I started to think about, I was like, okay, how do I, we have largely new believers who are in our church. How do I articulate this? And so the way that just came to mind to frame this was, okay, so the Apostle Paul says that God has so hardwired this principle of sowing and reaping into the fabric of the universe that to deny it is to mock God. Like this is so obvious that this is how that God has made the world to work, that if you try to deny that, you mock God. And so I started to think about, okay, what are some of the other examples of this? The first thing that came to mind was the book of Thessalonians. The Apostle Paul says, if one isn't willing to work, then neither should he eat.
Right.
And so what's the logic there? The logic is that the point of food is to give you energy to work. Mm-hmm. And if you're not willing if you're not willing to steward the food-borne energy that you're getting toward the end of work, then you shouldn't be getting the food to begin with. And if you follow that cycle long enough, what is it saying? If you're not willing to work, then you should die because you're not going to get the energy that you need. So Paul, like there's one example of sowing and reaping. We could go down. There's also this same logic is inherent in marriage and enjoying the fruits of marriage. So in God's economy, you get married and then you enjoy sex and childbearing. To do something out of that order is to deny the way that God has designed the world to work. It's to deny God's design in sowing and reaping. We could march down a bunch of things, but the one that, again, as a pastor, really hit me, has to do with Jesus, right? So what hit me was like, okay, in Islam, right, Allah can just forgive sins. And this is why Muslims have a problem. They're like, why did Jesus have to die? Allah could just forgive sins. He could just say, hey, I just forgive your sins. There's no need for a sacrifice. But in Christianity, like the soul that sins must die. Like there's a real payment that has to be made. If you take this action, there's a consequence. What you sow, or what you reap, you will sow. And so with we see this same principle within the logic of salvation, that God sends. He doesn't just give the papal declaration that your sins are forgiven. There has to be someone who actually pays for our sins. And so the thing that really hit me as I was, again, in parallel tracks, learning about, just money and thinking about money and thinking about Bitcoin was that, and thinking about money more broadly, is that fiat currency, which basically it allows governments and central banks and other, private banks to basically make themselves gods, where they can create money out of thin air and basically use it to subsidize whatever they want in the world. So basically governments, fiat currency allows governments to reap where they haven't sown. It allows them to get the benefit of work without doing work, and then kick the can down the road for paying off that work to who? The children, our grandchildren. And so this is what really just started to hit me. It just started to hit me like, man, this is very perverse. This is, the scriptures tell us that a godly man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and fiat currency creates a world where we're accumulating debts for our children and our grandchildren. And so we're effectively preying on, we're consuming, the value that basically should, we're rather than denying ourselves, we're actually consuming our children's value right now, and then leaving debt for them. So this is what hit me. It was just like, man, this is really, diametrically opposed to the way that God designed the world to work, and diametrically opposed to the way that the world has worked for most of human history. When you had scarce money, that again required this work to be done in advance. And so again, Bitcoin is just like this. There's no free lunch in Bitcoin. There's no getting Bitcoin without actually doing the work. You have to expend the energy on the front end.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think there's a lot of it's interesting because there's excitement about Bitcoin from a lot of different places. You have people that are really interested in privacy and
Yeah.
alternative, economies and things that are really excited about this way to transact that's supposedly not that's more anonymous. I don't know that I buy that. It seems like the whole
Yeah.
system, the whole way that the Bitcoin works is that everything is actually stored in the ledger forever.
Yep.
So
Yes.
it seems like the opposite of that. But the thing that, like, when I think about currency and Bitcoin, and I don't even want to pretend that I really know what I'm talking about, right? But I think about currency is solving sort of the problem of transaction costs and the fact that I don't know whether or not I can trust you, and so either you're going to give me the chickens in exchange for the the pigs that I'm giving you, and we're going to both show up and inspect each other's goods and know that it's trustworthy, or we're going to have a tool, a currency that we can trust represents something of equal value. And like the reason why I can use a credit card to buy gas is that it's either got a Visa or a MasterCard or an American Express brand on there, which is a name that, if I had just a credit card that just had any old name on it, and just made up a number like that wouldn't do anything either, because they would go, well, we don't know who the heck that card is coming from. We can't trust that it's going to work. It's
Yeah.
not sort of authorized. But it's still transacting in dollars. So I guess what I think about, what I think about, and I'd love for you to correct me on this, is just kind of
Yeah.
my own thinking about how monetary or how currency works. Is that currency is really solving a trust problem, and so that we can transact with each other, and and the storing value part, I think is, you said it's a chicken and egg. So I'm kind of curious if there's an argument about it, about the to me, the usefulness of it to facilitate transactions day in and day out is what really makes a currency effective as a tool. Because if a dollar is worth, buys me the same amount of gas and the same amount of eggs and the same amount of bread, same amount of milk, if that holds relatively stable over a year or 2 years, then I can actually use it to transact and do business. If it's swinging wildly, like Bitcoin seems to be doing or has been
Mm-hmm.
doing over the last couple of years, then I can't really use it. It's not very useful as a currency. It may be useful as a store of value, because I see that number, is over a long period of time moving upwards. So, like, as an investment tool, I totally see the value of it there. Um, and I think I wonder if there's anybody who argues that dollars are a real solid investment in and of themselves. I don't know. I'm sure somebody does, or I'm sure there's like
Yeah.
strategies for using dollars, but it's probably more like arbitrage, where you're like buying high and selling low, and doing that whole thing. But I think of the U.S. dollar as it has become the gold standard that the entire world functions off of. And at this point, you're right. It's not backed by. It's not really practical even for it to be backed by gold, because it's now become the world's currency. It really comes down to a brand. It's a name, that people trust. Um,
Well,
so I so, go ahead. Yeah, dive
let's
in.
talk about that. Yeah, let's talk
Yeah,
about that first, because that's a real thing. So again, man, there's a bunch of stuff there. I feel like the
yeah,
mosquito in the nudist colony. Like, where do we begin? But like, okay, so let's talk about how the dollar became the world reserve currency, because that
yeah.
really makes a big deal. So, and this was a big enlightening moment for me too. So again, I'm sitting there, I'm looking at our Venezuelan brothers and sisters who are in our church, and I'm like, man, Venezuela, this is heartbreaking. Zimbabwe, same thing, hyperinflation. Like, they have billions on their currency, on their paper money. It says 100 billion, whatever their unit is. And so I'm like, man, this is terrible. And so then I just started looking into this, and I realized, wait a second. Every currency in Latin America, many in Africa, and many other places around the world, every currency has failed 3 to 4 times since 1971. So while this was awful, it actually wasn't new, and actually again this had happened multiple times. And so then I started, as I'm doing this research, I'm like, well, what was so big about 1971? Like, why did that like kind of set off all these currency failures? And so again, I just started to do some research there. And so in 1971, they had what was called the Nixon shock, where Nixon basically pulled the U.S. Off of being backed by gold. And so then my question was, well, how did that happen in the first place? How did we get to a place where where the dollar was backed by gold? And so that story goes back to 1944 in the end of World War II. And so in the end of World War II, think about it. Basically, much of Europe had spent a lot of their gold reserves trying to survive the war. So they had paid, again, just think about this, obviously, or just naturally, they're sitting there, they need food, they need weapons, they need, all the bullets, they need all these kind of stuff. So
right.
who are they paying for that stuff? Well, the United States basically made out like gangbusters during World War II. We were out of the theater of war. We had some geographic isolation that protected us. And then we also have a humongous country that was able to produce a lot of things that other countries around the world needed. So by the end of World War II, the United States had a ton of the gold. They'd been paid a ton of the gold that had formerly resided in Europe. Fun little aside, another country that had its heyday during World War II was Uruguay, where we were missionaries. Uruguay has more, it's like 3 times as many cows as there are people. And so they were exporting a ton of canned meat and leather goods to all around the world. So you had this going on. And so in 1944, the war is drawing to a close. And the question arises, well, okay, so it looks like the Allies are going to win. What are we going to use for money in this post-war world? And so they decided to have something called the Bretton Woods Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Representatives from all kinds of countries show up in New Hampshire, of all places, and they sit down to hash out what are we going to use. Now, here's a slightly humorous question. So if you and I were here, and I imagine we're sitting in the same room, and a 900-pound gorilla enters the room, okay? Who's going to have negotiating power in the room?
Yeah.
Reality, it doesn't matter how, we can basically express our opinion, but at the end of the day, the 900-pound gorilla is going to do what he wants. So sure. The United States now has the lion's share of all Europe's gold. They're this big behemoth. They came out stronger than anybody out of World War II. And so really what happened is whatever the U.S. wanted kind of went down. Yeah. And so the agreement that the United States came up with was this. They said, let's just do this. We think that we should have, we'll create an artificial peg peg the ratio of ounces of gold that we have to a certain number of dollars. So it was either $25 or $35 per ounce of gold. And then what we'll do is we'll give you guys, other countries around the world, we'll give you dollar reserves. And you can hold your dollar reserves rather than gold in your vaults. And then you can create your own local currencies, your own national currencies based on a certain ratio of dollars. So you're basically, you have a daisy chain connecting the currencies to something scarce. Right. And then the U.S. said, we pinky promise that we won't break this peg of certain ratio of dollars to gold. And so, again, they don't have a lot of leverage. There were some other options, but they ended up deciding to do that. So from 1944 until 1971, everybody went along. Things were more or less stable. Not perfect. And then, again, the check on this system was that at any point, some of these countries that had U.S. dollar reserves could come to the U.S. and say, hey, we want to exchange some of our dollars for gold. And then that was supposed to be a check on the system. Right. So, again, throughout this time, though, a lot of these countries are appreciating the efficiency and how much easier it is to use paper currency. Yeah. So in 1971, I can't remember if it's Germany or France. I believe it's France. Comes to the United States and they say, we would like to exchange some of our dollars for gold. So they end up doing it. The next day, Nixon comes out and says, we're stopping the convertibility of gold for dollars. So why would they do that? Well, because what happened was, this is the United States declaring bankruptcy. What they were effectively declaring is that we don't have enough gold to back up all the dollars that are in existence. And so what had been going on is that the United States had been abusing its exorbitant privilege, is the name that it was given, to be the only ones in the world who can legally print the world reserve currency, which was US dollars. And so they'd been secretly printing this money and spending it all over the world. So everyone else is doing the economic calculus and thinking there's only this amount of dollars out there. And the United States was leveraging that information asymmetry that they had to benefit economically. Now, again, there's probably people who would say, well, people who would defend this. Oh, well, I mean, the United States was fighting Russia in the Cold War. And I mean, we had to protect ourselves. So, this was in the name of national security or whatever. There's all kinds of reasons that people could give. But the reality is that they were doing it illicitly. Nobody else knew. And so they weren't discovered until somebody came to basically put it, tested the system.
Right.
And so this is, you look at this, and so this is how the United States became the world reserve currency. Now, you may be sitting there thinking to yourself, well, if that happened in 1971, like, why do people still use the dollar primarily now? Right. And so that has to do with the thing that happened right after that, which is the United States negotiated basically the petrodollar. So basically, effectively the world reserve currency, went from gold to oil.
Right.
And so now, like, basically they negotiated the fact that at least the OPEC, and I think it was OPEC, some of these, basically the dollar would be the only thing that would be used to buy oil, or the primary thing that would be used for oil. The dollar was also, just due to the size, due to the global demand for it that had been happening since 1944. It was the de facto currency used for international trade agreements. Okay.
Right.
So you can imagine you have Zimbabwe and Uruguay are going to sign a trade agreement. Uruguay is going to is going to export soy. They have tons of soy. So let's say they're going to do that. What is Uruguay going to want? What currency are they going to want in exchange? Are they going to want the Zimbabwe, whatever the currency is called? Well, probably not, because there's not very much other demand for it. There's not many other countries that are itching to have Zimbabwe dollars or whatever they are. And so basically the dollar is very desirable. There's still tons of desire for dollars. So there's demand for dollars, both to pay debts and just to build up your own treasury reserves. And so due to there being so much more demand for US dollars, it has so much more value than any other currency. It's a supply and demand issue. It's a market issue. So again, that's what's going on. That's why there still today is so much demand for dollars. I describe it as it's the world's worst. It's like the world's worst beauty pageant. Okay, you don't need to be very pretty. You just need to be better looking than everybody else. And so, due to the fact that everybody else's currencies are only as basically there's way less demand, and again they're only as strong as their governments are fiscally responsible. The dollar is the best of the worst.
Yeah. It's one of the, like, I wonder, I mean, in my head, it feels like there was a time where a dollar represented something like, gold, like physical.
Yeah.
It's gotten to a point to where it doesn't need that anymore, because it represents everything on the planet. Like everybody in the world, exchanges their value, their work in US dollars, or it comes down to US dollars ultimately. And so it feels like it's a certificate of value that's universally accepted and acknowledged. And I think in a simplistic philosophical way, like, it shouldn't work, but it does, like it seems like it does. I mean, it doesn't work. I think it's true for sure that it doesn't work as a long-term holder of value. You need to get rid of your dollars and exchange them for something that's not dollars. And that's probably, Bitcoin is one of the things, I would say, like, because of the way that it's designed. But it seems like in order for anything to be an effective tool, like I can't agree to pay somebody a salary, $50,000 a year, and then and that person accepts the job if there's a doubt that $50,000 is going to be worth the same amount 6 months from now, right? So
yeah.
So if I were that person, I'd say, you're going to have to give me some assurance that in 6 months we can reevaluate what $50,000 buys and adjust my salary up or down based on the buying power. And it seems like that's what I'm kind of playing devil's advocate, by the way, because I'm I've always leaned like libertarian and Austrian. But as I think about it, it just, some of these questions come to my mind is like, if I'm that person in that situation, I'm wanting some guarantees of something that's going to be going to hold its relatively same value over the course of, not forever, but over the course of, a reasonable amount of time, like the amount of time I've got a loan on a car, or I've got a lease on a house, or on an apartment. And I feel like that's what the Fed, I think that's the argument maybe that somebody would make, is that's what the chairman of the Fed and the Treasury are doing, is they're kind of, it's like if a tool is like a blade, you use to, like a scythe that you use to cut wheat, like you've got to sharpen that blade for it to remain useful. And so in the same way, like it's an instrument, it's a tool that's used to facilitate transactions so people can just work and get stuff done and not have to worry about the instability of the units they're using of value. And it requires somebody like tinkering with it. If you just leave it alone, it's going to go all over the place.
Yeah, and so this is, I would say this is one of the fundamental lies that we have all just gotten really used to, right? So again, it really comes down to, again, I mean, we could go into a whole lot of things. Like there's, Adam Smith talks about it seems like there's this invisible hand that guides the market. And as Christians, we're like, hey, that hand belongs to God. Like if you submit to, and you trust the Lord, you submit to, you work hard, you do these things, like things actually do work out. Again, you can come up with all these ways. Again, and really this comes down to, what are you going to do when the worst happens? Okay. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, and this, the scriptures have a clear, repeated answer for how do you face down uncertainty in the future. There's a twofold thing. One of them is, do not be afraid.
Yeah.
Okay. Don't worry. Do not be anxious about tomorrow. Do not be anxious. Yeah. Does not the Lord know that you need these things? So there is tons of evil that is done in the world because that's justified based on, grounded. The justification for the grounding is, well, if I don't do this, then what's going to happen? I'm going to be in trouble if I don't do this. So that's one thing. Like on a biblical grounds, like we're called. We still have the same. We live in a very modern world, but we still need to trust the Lord, and that still is fine. On the other hand, at the same time, so that would be the vertical answer to this is, basically the Fed is trying to say we can't trust God. We need to have a system which we control completely. And by controlling every aspect of it, we're going to find freedom. This is fundamentally what they're saying. So again, the Christian answer to this is we trust God. Okay, we trust that we don't just make decisions based on trying to prepare for every possible thing that could come down the pike to hurt us. At the same time, what else do we depend on? Well, there's this thing called love, and basically providing for the needs of your neighbors. So what do you do? When your neighbor has, if you fall into great need, what did we do in this country in the world? How is the world operated? We didn't have large levels of high interest credit for the vast majority of human history. What did people do? How did they live? Well, they had to depend on their neighbors. They had to depend on people taking care of them. And so this is how, we've had like nonprofit hospitals for, even just in the United States for a long time. You had doctors who were willing to write off, huge debts that people accumulated. Hospitals, people were willing to give in order to do these things. So this idea that, we need the government to be able to create, we need a money that can allow the government to print money out of thin air to solve any problem is actually, it's basically, we're giving away the farm. You're giving away a lot of things in order to justify that. The other thing that I would say is, basically, you can't escape this with money, is that the same thing. So when money stops being, or when and if money stops being a store of value, okay, this is this intrinsic part of what money is, okay? When money ceases to be a store of value, then something else has to fill that vacuum. Okay, it's just like any other abdication of leadership. When there's a leadership abdication, something or somebody is going to fill that vacuum. Okay, and so when money stops being a store of value, which fiat currency effectively brings about, well, then something else is going to have to be a store of value. And so the question is, what have we seen fill that void? Well, it's been the stock market, it's been homes. Basically, for a lot of people, real estate has, in a very real way, it stopped being just real estate, and it's also turned into an investing vehicle. Yeah. And so, to the point that we have millions and millions of people are preparing to retire, and their ability to retire is based on their ability to sell their homes for more than they paid for them. Mm-hmm. And so they're expecting to be able to do this. This is their expectation in buying it. And so then the issue that we have is we look around, and who's the generation that is at least theoretically going to be buying their houses from them? It's generation who is it? Gen Y. You have these people, the next coming after them, and then you have my generation. So you have like the millennials. Right. You have following them, and we're at a point where, broadly speaking, we don't have the money to pay them more than they've paid for their houses. Mm-hmm. And so you get this point where basically, when things aren't able to be what they were meant to be, it ends up being a problem for everybody. It creates all kinds of issues. So you get this place where we're at this place where housing prices are at all-time high ever, where the stock market's at all-time highs ever, and money is increasingly worthless. With every day that goes by, they're printing more and more money. I just read this the other day that by the end of this year, the amount that we're paying in interest on the debt that the United States owes will have surpassed the entire budget for the Department of Defense. And so this is this thing where, like, this is not sustainable. It's not normal, and it's all a product of having a money that isn't a money that isn't serving the function that it was designed to play. And so that's one of these. Again, this has happened over and over again. The cool thing about this, and this has been, I think that's something I've really appreciated, is we don't have to speculate and just like try to play profit and just come up with these things. Fiat currencies die. Like all of them die. In all of the cases, they've died. And the average lifespan of a fiat currency is about 25 years. So the dollar in its current form has lasted for 50 years. So, twice as long as normal. But again, we're starting to see, cracking of the system. And part of this cracks come in the demand for the dollar, right? So what you're saying is, you just mentioned, like, everybody sees this dollar. It shouldn't be happening, but it is. Mm-hmm. And I would say that's true. It's to use a biblical example, right? Christ rises from the dead in 33 AD. Okay. Death is defeated. Rome done in, just the reality is, there's a new reality that's come into being, but it takes a while. Here we are 2,000 years later, and everyone still doesn't realize, the reality of what's happening. But it's true. It doesn't mean it's not true. The fact that everybody hasn't woken up to the reality doesn't mean it's not true. It just means they haven't woken up to the reality of it. Right. And the reality of the fact that the dollar is not, its value is now not rooted in something scarce or tangible. It's really rooted in fear. Right. It's also rooted in just the existing demand. Even that is coming to an end with the advent of things like the BRICS. Are you familiar with BRICS? So it's an economic union. So BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Okay, sure, so those are the pillar companies. They basically said, hey, we're going to trade with each other. But in the last couple of years, the number of countries that have joined BRICS is steadily increasing. You have more and more countries that are basically seeing, man, the dollar's getting weaker and weaker. And even if it wasn't getting weaker and weaker, they're increasingly moving into and creeping into our nation. They're making us, they're inflicting their will on us in ways that are continually against our national interest and only in their interest. And so you have that demand for dollars is starting to crumble. Right. Still is by far the dominant currency in the world, but the demand and people's desire, whereas again, when this whole arrangement started, people wanted dollars. People wanted, it was the best thing at that point. It actually it would actually help everyone. And now this arrangement is actually hurting everyone. It's actually working against their national interests.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like the strong. There were a few things you said there where it sounded like, if we've got to move away from, we got to get off of this sort of, this sort of artificial reality that we live in, where credit's cheap, and so in some ways you're kind of saying, hey, if we get rid of the dollar, life's going to be harder and going to be worse in some ways, or going to be hard, be difficult. There's going to be withdrawal symptoms, but you think that it'll move us towards a more stable or healthy future, and it also sounds like a big part of the argument that you're making is we want to remove this power that our government, this ring of power that our government has and wields.
Yeah.
I think it's, to kind of play, just to play the other side of the argument.
Yeah.
There are going to be people who say, I'm an American. I like that America wields this power. Like this creates some, benefit and safety for me. It sucks to be, in Venezuela, but just big picture, like a world, let's say 20 years from now, everyone's using Bitcoin, and Bitcoin has become a huge part of the global economy. How are things better? Like what do you think has become better in that world, and things that'll go away and things that will come to pass, if that were to happen?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing, again, the philosophy major in me won't let me move to there. So the first thing, so you basically said, imagine there's Americans listening to this. I'm guessing that's the the majority of your listener base.
Sure.
And so they're saying, hey, I like that the dollar is strong. Okay.
Yeah.
And so then basically what that is, that's a utilitarian argument, right?
Sure.
You're saying, hey, I like the benefits. And so because I like the benefit, I'm going to completely overlook the process of how we're getting there. And that's just not a Christian perception. That's not how Christians view the world. Like Christians, we don't just look at, man, what would be the best thing for me, and let's do that. Like just without qualification. And so so there's that. So again, Christians, we, especially as Christians, as somebody who, we're committed towards seeing the glory of God in all nations. This is where we care about these people across the world. These are our neighbors. These are our brothers and sisters. And so we should not just have this type of view of them that says screw them. Everybody just does whatever they want, and then the Lord works it out. Like that's the first thing. The second thing would be what was the other thing I was going to say? Okay. So the second thing is this. So you've got. The question is how long is this good for? Because again, the stated thing is, okay, well, hey, the U.S. is getting we're reaping the benefit of having the most valuable currency on earth, right?
Yeah.
So that's true. It is a benefit, but it's also a curse. It's also this thing that whoever holds the reserve currency, if it's not rooted in something that's scarce, it's not rooted in something outside of themselves. It actually does tremendous damage to the country over a long period of time. Yeah. And so the place that you can see this is in the loss of U.S. manufacturing. Okay. Now, why has the U.S. manufacturing base gone overseas? Because the primary export that the United States has is the dollar. This is the most valuable. All these other countries around the world, they all want this dollar because of these prior relationships that they've entered into. And so we are the dollar is so valuable on a global scale, still to this day, it's so valuable that our own workers who live and use this country actually can actually slow the amount of money that's able to be made by U.S. businesses, right? So hiring U.S. workers is far more costly than getting stuff made in China. And so what you have businesses that are just trying to make as much profit as they can. Again, I would say this is not, they don't have a Christian understanding of these things. And so they're saying, hey, in order to survive, like we need to make as much money as possible. How can we do that? Well, we can make way better margins if we're making our goods overseas somewhere, in some sweatshop somewhere. We're going to make better profit margins. The downside is that's jobs that are lost for normal people. That leaves all kinds of economic devastation, family devastation, all kinds of stuff in its wake. But in the short term, we're going to be able to make more money.
Yeah.
And so again, this is a problem. Like this works in the short term, but in the long term, we see what you see right now is A lot of the stuff, the reason that President Trump was able to come to office is because there's a lot of people in this country that feel like, where did my world go? Where did I can't? My jobs are paying nothing. I'm doing menial work that's not paying me a lot. Again, there are exceptions to this. Obviously, like if you, in the case that you do have somebody who has valuable manual labor, that labor is going through the roof. Okay,
Yeah,
so
sure.
if you have things that can't be easily made overseas, or you have the actual labor itself that can't be done overseas. Well, then you're actually having to pay somebody here, and that cost keeps going up. So plumbers, a lot of these manual trades, those guys you can print money doing those jobs. But for a lot of us who, especially because we've been fed this dogma for generations of, you have to go to college, you have to go to college, you have to go to college, you have to go to college at any cost. It doesn't matter if you're going to accumulate hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to get a degree in underwater basket weaving, from whatever it's going to be. You just have to go to college. And so we have a situation in which we have young people, and not even that very young people in their 40s, late 40s, early 50s, who they've accumulated tons of debt in the name of, this is just what you have to do. This is what you have to do. And now they're looking back on this and like, wait, this isn't what I was promised.
Right.
And a lot of the reason why it's not, what they're experiencing is falling short of what they were expecting, is because of the money that's undergirding, like the money that's undergirding their life, undergirding all of the incentives, or many of the incentives. That's basically the logic. It's undergirding the money that's undergirding the logic of the economy. And so again, and then I would say you mentioned, like, I guess maybe you didn't even mention this, but a related thing is, the temptation is for people to look at like a Bitcoin, or to look at even this issue and go, well, I mean, basically you're just saying that because you're an anarchist. You don't like the government. And so my answer to that would be, well, the question, we're at this point of definitional crisis. All right, all over the world, nobody knows what a man is. Nobody knows what a woman is. We don't know what marriage is. We don't know what much of anything is, really, because we've abandoned God and his defining. We've abandoned God, turned our back on him as the defining thing, and so we're just out there, everybody's around playing games. But two of the things, again, we talked about, we don't know what money is. Okay, for most people, money, they just think, okay, it's just this thing that I give in exchange for other things. It's completely arbitrary. We have no problem with governments just printing money out of thin air. When COVID happened, people were like, hey, airdrop us money. This will be great.
Yeah, right.
But the other thing that nobody knows that it is, nobody knows how to define it, is government. Like what actually is government? What responsibilities has God given it? Like how does God answer the question, what is government? And so a lot of libertarians, they might actually even be saying, I don't like this. We don't want government. I want government out of my life. And they're basically articulating a anti-government stance, which is really just an overreaction against the humongous government that they're experiencing. And so the way that I would describe this is, the government today is basically like this morbidly obese man. He's a morbidly obese man that's so fat that he can't do the things that God has given for a normal man to do. And so what is the solution for the morbidly obese man? Is it for him to just die or like kill himself? No. The what he should do is to get down to a reasonable size, so he's able to do the things that he was initially given to do. And so I would say the same exact thing about governments. Like our governments, we've so turned our back on even thinking about and submitting ourselves to the fact that there's somebody who can tell the government what they're supposed to do. And so here we are obliged, as a CRAC related podcast, to quote Doug Wilson, if there is no God above the state, then the state is God. And so this is one of these things where all of us have to, like, what you believe about government has a ton to do with what you believe about money, and vice versa. In the same logic of, we create our buildings and then our buildings create us, or we shape our buildings and our buildings shape us. We shape our money and then our money shapes us. And so, a lot of these same things are happening. So a lot of the pushback that's intuitive, that is instinctive, that happens, right off the bat, when people start to hear, like, wait a minute, the money that's not made by government, they start to think this is just some libertarian fever dream, and you just want to get rid of the government altogether. It's not that at all. It's saying it's unsustainable to have an undefined vision of what the government is and what it's designed to do. And you can get away with kicking that can of having that conversation down the road, but eventually it's going to come back with a vengeance. And that's what we're seeing.
No, that's good, man. Well, that's really good, Jordan. And I feel like, we've just scratched the surface. We talked about this prior to the podcast, that this touches so many things and has so many implications on so many different areas that it's really not something that we can do justice to in a short podcast. I know we both have kind of hard stops that we've got to hit, but what I'd love to do is follow up with another podcast, and this time we can get Rich on it, and he can listen to this as kind of the intro to tee up our next conversation. But I know you've got this conference coming up, and we want to tell people about it. Rich and I are hoping both to be at the conference. Will you tell us about it? Who's going to be there, and what are the dates, and how can people find out more about it?
Yeah, I appreciate you guys having me. Again, I appreciated, specifically Rich's work. I'm not as familiar with your work, but
no, I don't have anyone. I'm just a dude.
We love to have you guys. And again, I hope that the takeaway from this is like the conference is not just going to be a bunch of raving lunatics talking about Bitcoin. The goal for this is the title for the conference is Render to God. What is it? Oh man, I'm forgetting my own conference. Something in the economics of glory. We're trying to basically unpack a Christian vision for economics. This is the goal. It's not just Bitcoin. Again, Bitcoin itself, like it only matters because of what is undergirding it. It's important, and it's affecting a bunch of stuff around the world because of what undergirds it. And what undergirds it is something that's far more ancient than anybody, far older, and than most people. Then is intuitive to think about. So in terms of who's going to be there, we're going to have C.R. Wiley is going to be speaking. Chris spoke last year. We're going to have Glenn Sunshine, also of the aforementioned podcast. Dr. Ben Merkel will be being there. He's going to be speaking about the role of government in education and by extension, the government's money in education. Nate Fisher from American Reformer and a number of other things is going to be there. Jonathan Lehman is going to be speaking. I'm trying to think who else. And then there's a bunch of people on the Bitcoin front, but we have a ton of, again, large amount of pastors. John Moody is another one. John Moody is a farmer, regenerative guy in the regenerative agriculture world. So again, if you go to tgfb.com/conference, you're going to see a bunch of these speakers. And again, not all of these people are, like Bitcoin, are into Bitcoin. Again, some of these people don't like Bitcoin. So this is not just designed to be this party where all the Bitcoin people dance in a circle and talk about how great it is. There's going to be plenty of pushback. And I guess maybe the bigger, to some circles, I guess I would say in nerd circles, probably the one person I'm most excited about having is the author of this book that actually inspired the book that we wrote. This guy, Jorg Guido Holzman.
Sweet.
In God's providence, he's going to be there to speak. So
awesome.
So we would love to have you. You can find more information at tgfb.com/conference. And again, if you're a pastor or other church officer, you can use promo code PASTOR and get 60% off. Again, we really want church leaders to come and think about the issues that are undergirding the issues that you're talking about and having to deal with every day in your congregations. And we want to do what we can to get those people there. So.
Well, that's coming up really soon here. It's July 24th and 25th, and that's in Nashville. So it's coming up. We'll get this podcast edited and out there with hopefully enough time for folks to learn about it and check it out. Jordan, it's been super fun having you, man, and looking forward to getting you back on the show and we can dive into round two. If you're just listening to this again, go to tgfb.com/conference. Thank God for Bitcoin is what that stands for.
Yeah.
And you'll find out more about it. Hey man, it's been good meeting you. Been good chopping it up about Bitcoin, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in a few weeks here.
Definitely. Appreciate you, Larson.
All right, man. Cheers.
The God a Minute podcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might enjoy one of our other podcasts, The Good Life Podcast, featuring Matt Carpenter interviewing experts in their field about how their work contributes to the good life.